Transformative technologies and unprecedented public health mandates have led to the widespread adoption of work from home arrangements in Canada and elsewhere around the world. Work from home provides workers a lot of flexibility, but this flexibility can be both good and bad. Employees tend to like it, right? It means you have more control over work hours, you can have better work-to-life balance, you can have more control over your work tasks. But on the other hand, it could be a little negative because some people say that flexibility comes with more responsibility, and it could be used as a tool to control workers, whereby employers give them a little bit of flexibility, but ask them for more in return. So basically, our idea, the point of this paper is to look at how unions try to influence the adoption of work from home and its effects on workers in terms of flexibility. Meaning, what can unions do to make workers have better forms of flexibility associated from work from home and to avoid more negative forms of flexibility? And how do institutions matter in these relationships? The outline of the argument basically is we draw on data from contact centers. These are call centers, but they're starting to be called contact centers now because they do more than calls. They do chat, they do email. And we draw on data from contact centers in Canada, Germany, and the United States to argue that the presence of strong co-determination rights in Germany enabled workers in this country, in this country's contact centers, to have more positive forms of flexibility associated with work from home. The absence of similar rights in Canada and the United States made it more difficult. They still negotiated some important protections and relied on some protections in the past in Canada and the United States. But in the absence of co-determination rights in Canada and the United States, it was more difficult to negotiate some forms of flexibility, and they're less strong. We look at three types of flexibility. First, in terms of rights to work from home, the location of your work. Second, in terms of task autonomy, the ability to have discretion in the tasks that you conduct. And three, flexibility in working hours. We look at three ways that the Works Councils empower union influence over work from home in ways that differentiate it from Canada and the United States. These include one, the fact that Works Councils provide workers with broad consultation and veto rights over a large range of practices, including AI technologies. Works Councils can consult on them and veto them, work from home, scheduling practices, and performance monitoring. The second point has to do with the temporal dimension. Workers can influence, through Works Councils, they can influence day-to-day decision-making. You don't have to wait for a collective agreement to expire to negotiate changes in working conditions. You can negotiate it on the spot, and you can consult and veto on the spot. And this means as technologies are being adopted, you don't have to wait multiple years for them to be normalized in the workplace. You can influence how they're adopted immediately. So that was also important for Works Councils. The third point, it has to do with access to information and expertise, because Works Councils have a right to company-funded technology consultants. So Works Councils in Germany have the right to demand that a company pay tech consultants to provide them with advice on the adoption of technologies so that they're very informed on how the technologies will impact workers. Rights that are not available in Canada and the United States. There are many contributions in the literature, but due to wanting to satisfy Raul and not go over time, people can ask me this in question and answer or outside of this. But basically our contributions are to the discussions on the embeddedness of tech effects and adoption, how they impact workers. And we look at these in non-gig work settings. And as a lot of literature has been focused on gig work, we're looking at standard work and how this is impacted by tech change. In terms of the research context, the project is a larger SSHRC-funded project, it's actually the SSHRC-funded project is called Job Quality and Politics of Technological Change. We look at varieties of technologies in Canada, Germany, and the United States. We also have a co-project, which isn't mentioned here, with Ines Wagner, who conducted data collection in Norway. So it's Virginia and I that are working on this paper, but we were doing other work, related work with Ines Wagner in Germany. We have over 85 interviews and archival sources. These are collective bargaining agreements, works agreements, press releases, other. We have 3 companies in Canada, 4 in Germany, 7 in the USA. Slow down for the interpreter, I'm being instructed. Okay, I'll slow down a bit. I am a fast talker, my apologies for that. It's in the, that should have been one adaptation to the slide, but it's still ongoing. We've actually done most of the interviews and focus groups now, but we will be conducting surveys with the various unions, the Communications Workers of America, the USW, the Worker Empowerment Research Network, co-governed by, which is a large project based in the US. And finally, Unifor has also hopped in and wants to be part of the survey. We just learned this recently. Okay. And so quickly, why were there pandemic-related pressures? What were pandemic-related pressures that catalyzed work from home? One was the domestic public health mandates, of course. The lockdowns and physical distancing requirements meant that people couldn't be in the workplace anymore. The lockdowns meant people had to work from home, and physical distancing means people couldn't be clustered together in cubicles as they were before, even when the lockdowns were removed. There were changes in consumer behavior, growth in call volumes. More people were working at home on their home internet, which meant that there were greater volumes of queries, because this was the telecommunications industry that we were looking at. 3, there were instabilities in service supply chains. There were lockdowns in Philippines, India, Tunisia, and elsewhere. That meant there were fewer agents that could be offshore during the pandemic, which added pressures on domestic contact centers. Notes, though, there were some other ways. It wasn't just work from home that was used to alleviate, to satisfy this growth in demand. These telecom providers also invested in chatbots and conversational artificial intelligence, which expanded from 10% to 25% over this period to handle customer interactions. So in terms of the changes in flexibility, the key trends, German workers had considerably more favorable forms of flexibility than their counterparts in Canada and the US during pandemic. But Canada and the US, they are starting to negotiate collective agreements. They're catching up, but there's still a gap. And these refer again to the divergences I discussed in terms of rights to work from home, task autonomy, and working hours. And I'll go over each of these separately right now. And I should also mention there was some differentiation, of course, within the countries in terms of the core companies. Oh, you wrote 5 minutes. I have a timer going here, Raul, and I've got 7.5 on my timer. I pressed it.
After 12 minutes, I'm going to intervene vigorously. So.
Oh, okay, yes, for the 12 minutes. Okay, fair enough. Okay, thank you, Raul. So there was some differentiation between outsourced contact centers and insourced within the countries. And so here, this gives you, in terms of work from home, the rights to where you work. You can see that in Germany, there were significantly more in the agreements that we saw. And these were looking at works agreements for the most part. These refer to rights to initiate work from home, where the right was provided across the German contact centers we looked at. Rights to remain at home, rights to return to the office if things weren't going well. Equipment reimbursement, this means equipment for, your computer, your laptop, all of this kind of stuff. Internet reimbursement, and the company funded tech consultants to negotiate the adoption of the technologies. These were less in many of the other ones, and there's some variation across the companies in North America, but we can see, in one of the Canadian companies, they only had the right to return to the office, equipment reimbursement, and internet reimbursement. And one of the American companies, only the right to return to the office and equipment reimbursement, and some others only had equipment reimbursement. So you can see that there's some variation across the companies within North America, but they had less rights. There are some one important thing to mention, that there is legislation that provides rights to reimbursement expenses in some states in the US, which mattered as well. Second, task autonomy was higher in Germany than it was in Canada and the US, especially since the telecom providers cannot assess individual performance. They can only look at performance data on the aggregate. So you need at least 5 workers pulled together to look at their data. So you can't look at what one individual worker is doing. And in Germany, so when they're monitoring all their call activity through the screen, listening to the calls and all of this, they can't find out what an individual worker is doing, or when they're showing up and logging into the computers. Also, work from home added distance for managers. They were at home, they felt more distance from their management, and webcam monitoring was strictly regulated and prohibited, aside from certain uses, but not for large-scale monitoring. Canada and the US, task autonomy was lower. There were extensive individual monitoring, call monitoring, screen caps, these types of things. Even some workplaces are starting to monitor pauses in speech and tone of voice in the United States more than Canada. Work from home still adds distance for managers, so a lot of the employees felt more liberated, and the unionized settings had more restrictions, but there was still some very, it wasn't as high as in Germany. And webcam monitoring was often unregulated, though the new collective agreement provisions are regulating it. In Germany, work from home was also accompanied with more working time flexibility since workers couldn't be monitored on an individual basis. There was more flexibility in terms of punctuality when they showed up to work. However, we didn't find agreements like this in subcontractors. And the works councils have the ability to consult and veto over schedules in all contact centers. In Canada and the US, there were no changes in working time flexibility. Punctuality was far more enforced, and they don't have the consultation and veto powers they do in Germany. So explaining the North American outcomes. This is basically for a few reasons. One of them is that collective bargaining was a narrow tool for addressing digital work. The limited scope of past negotiations endured into the pandemic. 2 minutes, all right, I have 3.5 here, okay, fair enough. Many unions resisted work from home before the pandemic. There was an inability to negotiate new issues quickly evolving in the crisis. Under the Wagner Act, they didn't have strong rights to negotiate these issues. They were always hesitant to get into talking about work from home, worried about what would it mean for their members if they didn't have contact with them in the workplace. And this meant that they didn't have extensive provisions. So when it came, it was a shock to them, and their collective agreements hadn't been adapted to it. As work from home became widespread, however, union members started asking for it, demanding these things. Even one Canadian survey had 9 out of 10 members satisfied with work from home. Managers embraced it too, because it was good for productivity and absenteeism and these types of things. Worker isolation, reduced capacity for collective action was witnessed here. This started being less of an issue as they started adapting, but initially unions expressed concerns about isolation and weakened ties with members because they weren't in the workplace. There was a reduction in complaints and grievances. Part of this was because there were less issues, they were happier being at home, but part of it was they didn't need the stewards, so they felt less inclined to do this, to complain. And they were also fearful of management retaliation. Management was essentially sending them back to work because they didn't have rights to work from home if they were not productive. German outcomes. The Works Constitution Act provides works councils with broad rights to influence areas of relevance to work from home. Consultation rights and veto powers over remote work, use of AI, scheduling, and performance monitoring was contained in the Works Constitution Act. This was even strengthened in legislation that was introduced. I'll mention this in a moment. And for that reason, they were more inclined, the workers were more inclined, the Works Councils were more inclined to negotiate this early on, to say, let's experiment with it early on in the process. So prior to the pandemic, they actually had an agreement for work from home. They had a pilot project in 2019, so they're experimenting with it. They could adapt to it more easily because they had more rights over its influence. Worker isolation was a concern for them as well, like the North American case. But Works Council powers were largely unaffected because you don't need to get people together and be solidaristic to exercise power. Consultation and veto just requires the works councillors to exercise that against management. You don't have to get everybody pulled together to go on a strike or anything like that. So that's an important difference in the power. Management retaliation in exchange for work from home was less of an issue for this reason because of the strong rights of the works councillors. And the major telecom firm was actually keen on bringing workers back into the office, contrary to North America, because they were worried about being able to control workers at home because of all the restrictions that the Works Council introduced for positive flexibility, to maintain positive flexibility. The Works Council Modernization Act in June 2021, even that was introduced, strengthened Works Council powers to influence work from home specifically, to give the Works Council the ability to govern remotely and to clarify the ability that they have company-funded technology consultants to inform the introduction of AI. Now, I know that I'm almost going to be told to stop. Virginia is here as well if she wants to add anything later. But what does this story tell us? Flexibility outcomes from technological change are embedded in institutional environments. The Wagner model in North America was strict agreements and job classifications to handcuff both employers and unions in some ways. But works councils can encourage labor-driven flexibility. Worker militancy alone is not the answer. Our unions are losing and their actions might not make a huge difference, but sometimes they can. But it's really changes in institutions that matter. And one option that we just throw out there is joint technology committees in North America. And I'll stop now to prevent Raul from getting a little more worried.